Hello everyone, this is Darkfire Slide, and welcome to a guide for Field of Glory 2 Medieval. Today I'm going to be talking about a general guide for a list of every unit in the game, at least in the base set in this video. The purpose of this guide is to kind of make an index for people to reference, or for new players to learn the game, because educational resources about this game are fairly sparse as it is a very niche war game. So this video is more being made to cater to the small number of people that might actually play it, but you may find yourself interested in this game as I am describing unit interactions, which I think is one of the best parts of Field of Glory 2 Medieval. A quick point of reference for those who haven't played this game before. This game is a conversion of a tabletop war game, so one of the classic types of games that, predates Total War. Total War probably being the most well-known war game at this point. And to that end, I think it's a very good conversion of that. It takes away a lot of the obvious dice rolls and replaces them more with a percentage type system you might see in a game like XCOM, for example, rather than showing the actual dice. And changes a couple of other things around as well, as far as I can understand. And it's overall a very fluid experience. If you are into turn-based tactics games and prefer a, well-balanced and engaging experience, I can recommend this game. So notwithstanding that, of course, the introduction to this game itself, just because I figure a lot of people watching this won't have played this game before. I may be wrong about some of the units in this guide. I've played this game for 220 hours at this point, and that isn't enough to cover literally everything. So I have done the best I can with what I could, with what I know, as a means of which to explain how things work in this game. So this is more of a cursory glance at the list of units rather than a comprehensive guide of every single unit in the game, because as somebody else put it, one of the well-known members of the community who I've spoken to on multiple occasions at this point, every unit in this game could have its own guide, so just take that as you will. To that end, most of this video is going to be in general terms to save time, because most new players who are probably going to be watching this video aren't going to understand the deeper nuances of different unit types and why certain things cost a certain amount versus their battlefield performance, for example. So with that in mind, we can go ahead and start talking about the guide itself. Real quick, I do just want to say that if you don't fully understand the point of advantage system in this game, basically how this game functions is units have capabilities and an overall modifier when they are engaging in close combat, or in general for ranged units as well, that is dependent on their situation as well as their own equipment and training level. And this overall results in the point of advantage system, where more or less if a unit has a higher point of advantage over another unit, they are going to beat that unit in melee eventually. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, but generally speaking, if a unit engages another unit in melee and has a higher point of advantage, then they are going to win. Point of advantage basically comes from things like armor, unit training, the actual equipment of the unit as well. And those points of advantage apply in different situations. There are things that cancel point of advantage. For example, if knights try to charge into rough terrain, then they're going to have a hard time doing that because they can't get their lances down, get the momentum they need to charge, etc. And the game simulates all of that in its system. And one last thing, this video is designed for people who like to listen, so if you don't feel like watching this video, that's perfectly fine, because to be honest, the content is going to be kind of dry. I'm mostly not going to be doing any battles. I may show a couple of examples if I feel they're warranted. For the most part, I'm just going to be describing things, so that's perfectly fine if you just want to put this on in the background and just kind of listen, or just skip to the part of the video that you want to know about. Say, for example, you've started playing and you want to know how knights work. You can skip to the part about knights, look up that information, and then move on with your life. I don't expect anybody is going to sit here and watch this entire thing as I just mouse over units and describe them. So with all that in mind, we can go ahead and get into the actual guide about units. Alrighty, so the first type of unit that we are going to be talking about in terms of a broad category are heavy infantry, and I will be timestamping all of the moment, like all the different categories of units. So if you're looking for cavalry, you can skip to the timestamp with cavalry, and so on. But first, we're going to be talking about heavy foot, which are your basically just heavy infantry, is what they get called in other games. And just a brief description of most heavy foot. You want to use these units in the open. You want to avoid rough ground, forest, and marsh with them. Especially forest and marsh, these units can't perform. One important interaction you should know about is that spearmen who engage in rough terrain lose, or they don't lose their spear ability, but what they do lose is their defense against other units. So, for example, if you attack a swordsman unit in rough ground with your spearmen, the swordsman will gain their full sword point of advantage over you, meaning that the unit is going to, in other words, have better point of advantage than you, because when you attack into the rough ground with your spearmen, they gain a disordered modifier. They become moderately disordered. And that combined with the sword unit, such as like brigands, a lot of irregular medium foot, for example, when you attack into that, those units get their swords, and that means they're going to overall have an advantage over you. So you might attack a 30-point unit of brigands with a 39-point offensive spearman unit, only to find that your offensive spears are being more or less countered by the cheaper unit. So generally speaking, you want to deploy these units in the open. They gain a +1 on cohesion tests while they are steady, so at full morale and not disordered. This is against everything, so if they lose a close combat, they're getting a bonus to their cohesion tests. A +1 doesn't sound like a lot, but it's something like a 15 to 20% better resistance to losing cohesion checks, which is this game's form of morale. And basically, heavy foot are a lot harder to break because of this, whether through being attacked by missiles or from getting charged by cavalry, even. So these are your front line. These are the backbone of your army, whatever you want to call it. Spearmen of the heavy foot are kind of a moving wall, especially defensive spearmen, as the name might suggest. And what you can do is kind of position your entire force around this wall of spears, is kind of what you're going to be doing with most armies. And with that in mind, other heavy infantry are going to have access to other weapons. For example, the most common type of other heavy infantry are going to have a heavy weapon. And what this weapon does versus spears is it performs better against armor. So in the melee phase, so not while charging, heavy weapons ignore the armor of other unit types, which means that if a unit with heavy weapons attacks, for example, an armored spearman unit, or they get into the flanks of a knight, for example, in the actual melee phase, not impact, not the charge, then they will perform a lot better against those because they negate that point of advantage. Otherwise, spears and heavy weapons are remarkably similar in the open. So that's just something to bear in mind when you look at these, because it can be kind of confusing seeing a unit with heavy weapons versus spears. For the most part, they are incredibly similar. Spearmen are usually cheaper, though, because heavy weapons have that armor canceling property. Heavy weapons also technically, well, I guess they don't really perform better in the rough. Never mind. Anyway, so the first unit we're going to look at, this is our finally we're talking about a unit. We're going to look at raw spearmen. So this is a unit that is available to many lists, which is why I wanted to talk about it specifically. I could lump them in with defensive spearmen and armored spearmen. So as we can see, this Norman list has all three of these. So these are all defensive spears, but the relative training level of the unit drastically changes how you use this unit. So how should you use raw spearmen? Raw spearmen, unless they have a significant advantage, such as being uphill against other infantry, should avoid being on your front line, because these units will break. And one thing that's really unfortunate about raw spearmen is they lose the +1 cohesion bonus that most spearmen get, most heavy foot I should say. So if you deploy these in the front line and they start losing to another unit, they are not only going to lose the close combat because of their training, which gives them a -25 to their point of advantage, which, as you know, if a unit is down point of advantage, they are probably going to lose unless, another unit comes and helps them, basically. So these units are going to lose not only to offensive spearmen and other heavy foot, but they're also going to lose to defensive spearmen. One thing about defensive spearmen is that they cannot charge. They don't have any impact point of advantage. So this unit has the inability to charge basically anything in the game except for other defensive spearmen. So the problem is, if you deploy the raw spearmen on your front line as like the first unit to hit contact, other defensive spears can charge these, which largely negates a lot of their effectiveness in terms of being able to actually hold a flank. So typically how I use these is I use them as a reserve. So say you had a unit lose a couple of close combats, they lost that 12% chance to win, or they lost that 12% chance to lose, rather. They start to break. You can set these spearmen up to kind of be as like a final stopgap in like your second line, for example. Something else that raw spearmen do is they still get their spear bonus against regular lancer cavalry. Now, you don't want to put these up against knights. Knights have the knightly lancer capability, and knightly lancers are going to absolutely murder raw spearmen. Never, ever, for any reason, except maybe if you park raw spearmen in rough terrain uphill or something, use these units against knights, because knights will absolutely crush and demolish them. So they do, however, still block normal cavalry. So light spear cavalry and normal lancer cavalry still cannot charge these units because they don't get any or their full point of advantage against this unit. So that makes them incredibly cost effective at that role. They're also great for putting on your flanks if you know you're going to be fighting an enemy that is going to be shooting you a lot. So horse archers, for example, can very easily charge massed bowmen. So units like this group of archers here, that have no melee ability whatsoever. These are massed bowmen. They have no ability to defend themselves with melee. Raw spearmen are a good complement to these units. If you expect to be defending against, for example, horse archers, those light spear cavalry, for example, these can kind of stand in front of them while the bowmen put pressure on or even disrupt and break the enemy opposing cavalry. So these units have the ability to be incredibly cost effective. However, they are also very vulnerable, and you need to be careful when you use them. In campaigns, these units are also attractive because as they gain experience and become, I think it's enthusiastic level, so it goes average, above average, enthusiastic. It's either at enthusiastic or superior veterancy, usually about 50 to 70% of the way through the campaign. These will actually turn into regular defensive spears, meaning that they're a lot cheaper. They're a lot cheaper of a way to get those units, so it's a great way to fill out a line over the course of a campaign. And with that in mind, we can now talk about regular defensive spears. So regular defensive spears are pretty average. How you use these units is, as I described with kind of the general heavy foot description, you want to use these as a moving wall. They are still fairly vulnerable to knights, but the important thing to remember about defensive spears is that you can outnumber knights with these. Now, that being said, you don't want to only deploy these spearmen against your knights and sergeants and such, because they will eventually break. But parked on a hill, in numbers, if you can, for example, outflank knights with these units, they can be effective at defeating them. And if you can stop a knight from retreating, you block his path from behind him so he can't cycle charge you, these units, as long as they are steady, will negate the swords of knights, meaning that the knights are incapable of fighting these units. And it's worth noting that a defensive spear unit is half the price of a knight, more or less. So in terms of using these are going to make up your main front line. Now, I've said all these things about how you can use them to defeat knights. Unfortunately, they are still rather vulnerable to them. So you want to be supporting these units with your own knights if you know you're going to be up against them, or things like crossbowmen, light units, etc. These exist to act as a wall and hold the line while your more capable offensive units get the job done. So for example, you might know that your left flank is doomed based on the map or the matchup or whatever, but you know that you can throw some defensive spearmen into a tactically advantageous position like a hill, for example, and that will allow you to get a lot of value out of these defensive spearmen. In campaigns, especially as they gain experience, these can become some of the most cost-effective units in the game, as they just continually hold the line against threats and such. And with a general, they aren't slouches in fights, but obviously you only have a limited number of those, so you can't always depend on that. And I think that's all I want to say about the regular spearmen. And I want to mention armored spearmen as well, because on paper, this unit is more or less just an upgraded version of defensive spearmen, but there's something you should know about these units, which is that they aren't actually better at tanking impacts than the regular defensive spearmen are. So what you're paying for when you get these armored spearmen is a unit that is more resistant to missiles, which is important, especially against the period you're going to be using these spearmen in. You're going to be fighting a lot of regular bowmen, for example. And against those units, the extra armor is going to help them not be disrupted by arrows and such. And so that makes them an attractive option against horse archer armies and against just archer heavy armies in general. Especially the armor seems to help a lot against light units who at longer ranges have a very hard time dealing with that. As well, these units can often charge on other defensive spears, and they will win in the combat over time after the impact, because the armor is giving them that slight point of advantage that will allow them to eventually break them. So this is one of those situations where it's a minute difference, but it's something that you should know about, that these units are a little bit more capable of being offensive, especially in defensive battles. Now, I should probably mention this. I should have introduced the raw spearmen like this. These spearmen units are kind of your, think of almost like your Viking shield wall, if you will. These units are standing in a thick formation, shield to shield, spear to spear, and kind of fighting that way. So you should think about these units that way as I'm talking about them. Now, the next unit we're going to talk about looks incredibly similar aesthetically. These are offensive spearmen. These are available to a lot of the Nordic lists and a lot of the, I call them Norse or old Germanic or lists like that, basically. So things like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the 1066 English before they became the Anglo-Normans are going to have these offensive spearmen. So Poland has a unit of these as well in the form of dismounted cavalry. And how you use these units is pretty interesting. So unlike defensive spearmen, offensive spearmen do gain an impact point of advantage. They gain a 100 point of advantage over other units when charging. So this is useful for a number of reasons. Against defensive spearmen, this means that they are going to be at the same point of advantage when they charge. So the reason that this matters is you can use these units to safely pin other units, and when you have offensive spearmen, defensive spearmen are unable to charge them effectively because they no longer have the ability to gain impact. Because every time a unit charges in this game, it's assumed that the other side is counter-charging. So basically what will happen is the defensive spears don't have training in charging as a cohesive unit, while the offensive spears do. So when that charge occurs, the offensive spearmen are organized, disciplined, etc. in charging that way, while the defensive spears are kind of disorganized when charging that way. And as a result, that means that the offensive spearmen have a huge advantage in this regard, and their cost is only a couple points higher, but their overall value can be a lot higher, because one major difference between offensive and defensive spears is that offensive spears can charge medium foot, bowmen, and even lighter cavalry. So non-lancer, non-knightly lancer cavalry can be charged by offensive spearmen. And so that just makes these units incredibly cost effective and makes the lists that they come in fairly potent in my experience, especially if you're learning the ropes and getting used to the game, playing against the AI. The AI often has a hard time dealing with these units because they still have the high morale and defensive capability of defensive spearmen, but they are only slightly more expensive. Now, all of this being said, one thing to worry about with offensive spearmen is that as they win close combats, and you know, they deal heavy casualties to the enemy, they'll actually push them back. I believe the amount necessary for this is it's either 2 or 2.5 rounds worth of close combat victories, and the unit will pull back. You know, it'll push forward and break the enemy unit. And what can happen as a result of this sometimes is your own unit can get flanked, it can get overwhelmed and outnumbered as it pushes forward. So that can happen. Most of the time it's not too big of a deal, but it is something to be, you know, cognizant of as you're using these units. All right, and just real quick, I wanted to mention as well that the English 1066 list, so these would be the Anglo-Saxon English defending against William the Conqueror, get these nice armored offensive spearmen, which do everything I just said about the regular offensive spearmen, but they also get that armor bonus in the melee phase, which, as we discussed before, is incredibly useful, as well as that missile resistance. So I just wanted to make a brief mention of this unit. I believe this is the only armored spearman type unit in the base set of the game, or armored offensive spear. One or two more lists might have these, but I think these are something unique to the 1066 English list. Now, having said what I just said, there are more armored offensive spearmen, but they usually come in this form right here, which is dismounted knights and sergeants of the early period. So any list that's between, I'd say, 1000 to 1100 or 1000 AD, I suppose, these are functionally similar to offensive spearmen, but a major difference is that they are superior in terms of troop quality. In combat, this means that in the impact phase and in melee, they are getting an additional 50 point of advantage over other units, which means that it is very safe to push into defensive spears with these units, to push into a lot of heavy infantry with these units, and they do all the other things I already described about offensive spearmen, just better. They are accordingly expensive, but these are very powerful units. What you can do is way to flank with these, and what I mean by way to flank is you can put multiple of these units on a flank you would like to have collapse, more or less, and these units are going to be capable of doing a lot of damage on that flank, just due to having that better unit quality. As a result, the extra armor is of course also useful on these units, and their price tag is definitely usually a good reason to it's still good to bring them even though they are expensive. You may not be able to max them out every battle, just depending on what your settings are, but these are overall very cost-effective units, similar to other spearmen, but unless they even outnumbered, these units can often perform well enough to defeat a lot of other units at the same time, especially if you give them the other advantages you give other units. So, for example, on top of a hill against multiple other spearmen, these units can still sometimes come out on top even in like a 2-on-1 situation. So overall, very powerful units. A lot of the early European lists get these, so it's worth looking into these for sure. Now, worth noting in the earlier period is that there are also going to be, I think only the German lists get these. There are these dismounted knights and sergeants that only have the armored level of armor, but have a heavy weapon instead of spears. These units are going to perform very similarly to the offensive spearmen, but a major difference with these is that these cancel the armor of other heavy infantry. So in a way, these units are kind of some of the best infantry you can field, both in this period and when you use the later ones. Now, these units are still fairly vulnerable to missiles. They're more protected, obviously, as we've discussed, but in terms of cost effectiveness, these are still some of the best units in the game. Another similar unit to this would be the Swedish Huskarls, which I believe are the same profile. So they're superior troop quality, armored, and with a heavy weapon. And these are just kind of dependable heavy infantry that you can look to, heavy foot, that will more or less get the job done most of the time when you need to push a flank, take on other units. And a lot of battles online that I've seen will result in a line of these going up against another line of these, just because these units are just so cost effective, basically. So definitely a unit that you want to be using when you're using these lists for sure, alongside your spearmen, of course. Now, a natural evolution of these units would be, these are called the same unit, dismounted knights and sergeants, but we call these late dismounted knights and sergeants because they start appearing in lists starting at around 1200 AD. The main difference between these is that they become heavily armored. Now, knights and sergeants are also heavily armored, but what's different about these units being heavily armored is that infantry heavily armored is more effective than cavalry heavily armored because they don't have horses to have to worry about that are more vulnerable to projectiles. So these units are incredibly resilient against missiles. They are almost impossible to disrupt with archers. They can be disrupted by massed crossbows if crossbows can get into position, but the extra 9 points of cost compared to the earlier knights and sergeants is reflected in that. The heavily armored capacity also means that these units crush regular defensive spearmen even more than the previous knights and sergeants. So these units appear mostly in the base set in the German list and a few others, but for the most part that's where you're going to see these, and that kind of makes them unique to that. Now, this is another one of those gradients. This unit, the Islesmen for the Scots and the Ostmen for the Irish and some of the other English lists, especially the earlier ones. These units are heavy. They have heavy weapons, but their troop quality is only average and their armor is only protected. So normally with these types of units, when you use dismounted knights and sergeants, for example, you're expecting that level of quality of being able to push with these units, being able to deal a lot of damage with these units. These units are not quite so effective, and that is reflected in their price. The main advantage of these units is that they can go toe-to-toe with armored spearmen for for like a little bit less cost, but overall they are roughly as effective as spearmen at 39 points. On the defense, though, these units do not get a bonus to their impact POA from like knightly lancers, so regular lancers, for example. So unlike spearmen, these units are actually quite vulnerable to being charged because they don't partially negate the charge bonus of those knightly lancers. So leaving these in the open where they can be charged by knights is actually quite scary. So you want to be careful when you use these to not deploy them in situations where they're going to be hit by that. That's similarly true for the regular dismounted knights and sergeants, but those units have superior quality, which means that they are going to be able to resist at least a little bit better than these units. These Islesmen and Ostmen and any other average protected heavy weapon foot that you find are going to, for the most part, be crushed by knights. So just something to consider there with these units. Now, next we have a very unique unit. This is the standard wagon. In the base set, these mostly appear for the German list. So again, the Germans getting just like a really wide variety of unique units in that regard. For the most part, how you use this unit is you keep it close to your front line. It acts like a general in the sense that units surrounding it get a +1 to their cohesion checks. This can make heavy infantry around it very difficult to break if they are in the supporting range of it. And the best part is they act as an above average defensive spearman for their price. Now, something else very powerful that this unit does is it reduces the effective rout percentage of your own army. So what this means is that normally if a knight routing would cost you 4% of your routed percentage, that unit might only cost 3% or 2% now, probably 3%. That means that as long as this unit is on the field, you can take more losses without losing the match. But if you do lose this unit, it counts a lot towards your rout percent, usually around 10% or so by itself, which is quite a lot for a single unit. So this is a unit to maybe not throw in the thickest of fighting, but definitely one that you can use on your front line if the situation calls for it, or at the very least it can, sit behind the rest of your line and be able to give that +1 to cohesion checks, which will make your morale situation overall better. Now, the last archetype of heavy foot that I'm going to talk about in this video, just covering the base game lists of units, are the Scottish Spearmen and the Low Country Spearmen. These two units are identical. They are average quality, protected spearmen, offensive spearmen. And what's interesting about them is they have a larger troop size than normal. So you may have noticed on the battlefield that units have a certain number of ranks. So most spearmen are only going to be 2 ranks thick. These units are 3 ranks thick. And basically what it means is that as units lose the units in their ranks, they begin to get a stacking combat size modifier penalty as they fight if they are against a unit that has more effective men than they do. So how these units work is they begin battle against enemy units at a similar strength. So against 36-point spearmen, for example, they're going to charge in. They're probably going to do nothing. It's just going to be a draw. But then what happens is, as the enemy unit loses more and more combats, this unit has a 3rd rank that acts as kind of a reserve for the rest of the unit. So what that means is that this unit will not lose combat strength effectiveness for a very long time after it starts fighting. And that can be very dangerous, and basically means in the open that if you are fighting against these units, that your own spearmen are usually on a timer to fight these, which makes them quite effective. Something else, and another reason these units are so expensive, though, in addition to being able to do what I just said, and that combat modifier is pretty high. It can negate a lot of advantages that other units have. But one advantage that these units have as well is they can form a square. And how that works is the unit becomes unflankable completely on all sides, and even if you surround it with from multiple directions, it will not take any penalties normally associated with that, and cannot have an automatic cohesion drop, like morale drop, from having being charged from multiple directions, which is quite strong. The cost of this, however, is that they also lose the ability to project a zone of control, meaning that while they are in a square, other units can walk by them. And one thing I will add, since this is the final unit I want to talk about in the heavy foot section, I believe that this will be all of the heavy foot archetypes that appear in the base game. Heavy foot, one of the main things that they do is they project zone of control onto other units. So for example, if you want a unit of knights to not break into a flank, for example, you can cover another unit's flank with that spearman's zone of control, and you can also move defensive spearmen forward to lock other units in, more or less, just by pointing the unit at another unit. So heavy foot is really good at this because heavy foot is very hard to break. So as soon as your unit gets zone of control locked, it can be very difficult to break that unit out of it without falling back, and thus taking your own cohesion check in doing so, which can be disastrous. And you also can't deal with that without breaking the other unit in the process. So that is something else that you will want to be doing as you use heavy foot. And with that, I think I will conclude talking about the heavy foot. We're going to now move on to medium foot, which cover a much different role. Alright, so now we're on to the medium foot section, or medium infantry. So in a lot of other strategy, war games, stuff like that, these units are usually just throwaway garbage that you don't really care about. I think especially of Medieval 2 Total War, where non-elite heavy infantry are kind of bunk, and spearmen are only dealing with cavalry, for example. In this game, medium infantry are actually quite powerful. They have the advantage of being able to fight in rough ground without taking a hit to their organization. They don't become disordered in rough ground. And in forest, they become moderately disordered, as opposed to heavy foot and heavy cavalry, or all cavalry rather, which become severely disordered in forest. So medium foot are generally used to lock down areas that have rough terrain or forest and stop an enemy from advancing through there to get a flank. And basically you can also do surprise zone of control with units from these, locking units into more or less just having a staring contest with your medium infantry, because they know that if they charge your medium infantry in those situations, they are more or less going to lose, almost without question, unless they're being attacked by other medium foot. Now, they also have other uses apart from just parking in that kind of terrain. They can be used to set up flanks, as most units can, including unarmed bowmen, can be used to set up flanks, but medium infantry are often rather cost effective in that regard. For example, right here we have these Irish kerns, which are only 30 points. And, on an economy of scale, that's, something like a 12% discount compared to maybe an 18% discount compared to a unit of defensive spears. One trend with a lot of medium foot, though, is that they're not going to be as well armed as other as heavy foot, for example. So these Irish kerns, for example, they're only 30 points, but they've also only got a light spear for impact, and only half the unit is swordsman capable, meaning that their point of advantage in the melee phase is going to be a lot less than a lot of heavy foot is going to be in their melee phase. So always something to keep an eye out with medium foot is that kind of performance, because, for example, these kinds of units, this archetype of unit that has light spears and swords, is going to do well. They're going to do okay on impact, but then once the melee starts, it's all over for them because they can't stand up to spears for the most part. And without further ado, oh, and one more thing. They actually are more vulnerable to heavy foot in the open, especially. So on open ground, these units actually take a penalty to their morale, their cohesion check when fighting against heavy foot, which means that using these in the open is even more of a dangerous proposition. These units should not be a part of your main line because they will almost invariably get crushed and have no value to you. So just be very careful when using these units, especially against enemy armies that have a lot of heavy foot and on open maps. One more thing is that these units are generally capable of attacking massed archers. They don't have very good armor a lot of the time, but if you can close them to melee range without them getting disrupted, they can do a lot of damage to those types of units and potentially get some breaks for you. These units of Irish kerns, for example, are only 30 points. A unit of massed archers is usually 36, and these units can also, for example, fight crossbowmen who cost 39 points, but these Irish kerns cost 30 instead. Now, this is assuming these units don't get shot to pieces on the advance, which they very well may. But if they can get the drop on ranged units, they can do quite well against them. Against cavalry, these units will suffer similarly. Light spear cavalry, they can sort of do okay against, but against any kind of lancer cavalry, especially knights, these units are just going to completely disintegrate. And again, it just goes back to not using these units in the open, using them as ambushers and to lock down forests and rough terrain. And with that, we can talk about the actual first unit on this list. I've mentioned them a couple times now. These are the Irish kerns. They have a light spear, which is kind of like, it's a combination of throwing javelins and then using javelins in the actual impact phase. And what this allows them to do is get a 100 point of impact advantage on impact. But once the melee is joined with these units, they only have 50% swordsman POA, which means that they are only going to get half of the normal bonus that you would normally get for having swords, which is 50 instead of 100. What this means is that these units, these are kind of, I don't want to say the raw spearmen of medium foot, but these units are more or less very cheap units to park in forests and rough terrain to stop enemies from advancing, or at least stop them from advancing very quickly. Now, that being said, these units can actually defeat knights in rough terrain because knights become severely disordered. So again, you can kind of use these to stop enemies from going through rough terrain to get onto your flanks and stuff. Now, this archetype of unit is very common in a lot of lists. So Irish kerns are exactly the same as the irregular foot you will see in a lot of European and Eastern European lists. So when you see these two units, they are functionally the same in that regard. Now, one of the more interesting medium foot units, this unit kind of breaks the mold of a lot of medium foot units, are these Welsh spearmen, as well as the free canton foot from the a lot of German lists get them, as well as the actual free canton list itself. This is kind of the proto-Swiss. And basically, what these units do is they have spears, but they don't become disordered in heavy terrain or in rough terrain the same way that heavy foot does. So these units are really oppressive in situations where there is terrain available, because unlike units with light spears with only swords, for example, as we're going to see later, these medium foot spears are just very, very potent in these types of situations. They deny any kind of sword point of advantage, and these ones can even form square as well, thus preventing them from being flanked and making it just very difficult to dislodge them. They're also quite large in size, similar to the Scottish spears, meaning that even in the open, they still have a lot of utility against regular, like heavy foot, for example. Now, part of the problem is they are medium foot, unlike the Scottish spears, which means that against heavy foot, they are going to suffer a cohesion check if they lose melee. So these units can be a little bit risky to use. They're a little bit flimsier than those units, but overall these are incredibly cost-effective units, as you would expect from most spearmen. Alright, now next on our list we have the Irish Foot. These units are fairly unique in that they are a medium foot unit with a heavy weapon. For a while these were some of the deadliest units in the game. I believe they only used to cost 39 or something like that. And what's really scary about these units is they're more or less as effective as the Welsh Spearmen we just talked about, minus the bonus size, but for a much more reasonable cost as well than 50 points. So these units are quite effective in the rough. They will do well against units that only have 50% swords, for example. So they do quite well against bowmen, they do quite well against crossbowmen, which only have 50% swords, and they do quite well against the irregular foot that only have 50% swords as well, which appear in a lot of lists. Now, they are only average troop quality, so they are going to usually have to grind down their opposition, but for the most part, they're actually quite effective. And then this is specific to Irish lists. We have these picked Irish foot, which picked, by the way, means hand-picked. It's just like a shorthand for saying hand-picked, saying that these are the best warriors from each company. We're just going to form them into one unit. I know I was always curious about that when I would read about that in games, so I thought I would explain that little detail. Anyway, these are superior versions of the Irish foot, which, as we kind of discussed with the dismounted knights and sergeants earlier in the video, troop quality can be very effective in allowing units to push through enemy formations, and this is no different here. Now, what's really awesome about the picked Irish foot is because of their superior status, they can actually do quite well against spearmen in the open, so long as they don't lose their close combat and thus suffer a cohesion check, because they are still technically medium foot, meaning that if they lose close combat, they are more likely to break, because they neither have the +1 of heavy foot in the open, nor do they... plus they also get that -1 against heavy foot in the open, which means that these units can be a little bit risky to use in the open, because there's a good chance that they're going to break when they lose a close combat, which can happen sometimes. You know, it might only be 10%, might be less than that, but if it happens, you might be feeling it. That said, these units absolutely dominate the rough. They're just absolutely like a threat in those situations, and if fighting against... Now, thankfully, they only appear in this, I believe, in this Irish list, which means that you won't encounter this unit very often, but in the event that you ever do fight against these, or a similar unit of superior medium foot, just be aware that any units that you have in the rough are going to be quite at risk from this unit. Very quickly, I did want to mention that one other list in the base game gets this unit archetype. They aren't superior, but the Polish do get a small number of these axemen to use in the rough as well, but these are more or less identical to the Irish foot. Okay, now another extremely common unit that you will see in a lot of these European lists especially are these brigands, ribauds, etc. I call these brigands, some people call them ribauds, whatever you'd like to call them. These are just medium swordsmen. Now, how you use these is you want to engage them against targets that don't have impact. So, for example, the irregular foot that we discussed have a light spear, which makes them better on the impact. If the brigands can engage them in impact and not break, they will win against them, because their full swordsman POA is 100, while the irregular foot will have 50, for example. That being said, against other units that have no impact, such as massed archers and against crossbowmen, for example, these units are going to absolutely demolish them just because of the massive point of advantage difference. These units are also quite effective at flanking spearmen. Now, swordsmen, if they are caught against spearmen that are steady, so for example, the unit hasn't lost any cohesion, so it's still at full morale, it's in the open, etc. These units are going to they're going to do absolutely nothing because half of their swordsman point of advantage gets denied against steady spears. But if you throw these units on the flank, they get an impact POA just from flanking. So even though they don't have an impact weapon, attacking from the flank still gives them the opportunity to flank. And once they are in melee, these units are very effective at defeating heavy foot that has already been disrupted. Against heavy foot that doesn't have spears, so dismounted knights, for example, if they can get in and kind of help, they can get in and help overwhelm those types of units. Although without an impact POA, it is kind of risky to do this, especially because they do take a cohesion modifier penalty against heavy foot in the open. So in a nutshell, these units are very common, so I wanted to give a little bit more detail about them. You typically only want to use these in the rough, but if you can get a flank on spearmen with these and get that automatic cohesion drop down to disrupted, these units are very cost effective against those as well. So these are nice supporting units to have to deal with archers, to deal with other medium foot. They can still zone out heavy cavalry as well, like other medium foot. So overall at 30 points, this is a very cost-effective unit. Just make sure you keep them in the rough, or they're going to suffer a lot. Now, this unit is more common in the Field of Glory 2 original, the one set during the classical era, so with like Romans and such. These units have the impact foot capability, which against other infantry gives them a plus 200 point of advantage against those units. So using these units is a little bit of a gamble against heavy foot, because while they have the advantage on the charge, the problem is that if they don't break the enemy spearmen on the charge, they are going to potentially become disrupted once the melee phase starts, because their swords are only half as effective against steady spearmen. However, these units are great in the rough. They do quite well on impact against a lot of units. The brigands we just discussed, for example, are terrified of these units because these units are almost certainly going to win the impact phase, which means that in the rough, these units can be very, very aggressive as a result. Now, something worth mentioning is these Baltic foot in particular are warriors, which means that unlike other infantry, so medium foot and heavy foot, these units will pursue broken enemies. So if you get this unit to attack an archer and it breaks that unit of archers, they're going to chase after them for 2 or 3 turns, usually after doing that. And this can cause a lot of issues for you, as you may suspect. Now, there is an upgraded version of these, and just wanted to briefly mention them because, as with all other units that have superior, these units are going to do better in a lot of situations. It is worth noting, however, that the point of advantage caps at either 200 or 250, which means that in some instances the superior moniker isn't going to matter as much for them. So fighting archers, for example, or against units that only have swords, the superior is only going to help them in the melee phase, but of course these units are only going to be used if you have if you play them in a campaign, which is going to be rough because the Baltic list is very limited, or as allies in a multiplayer or custom battle. So you're probably not going to see these types of units very often, but that being said, just be aware of some of their intricacies. And then one of the lists that gets these, though, that you may play would be the Rus, who get these Finno-Ugrian warriors who function identically to the Baltic foot we just discussed. Now, one of the most unique medium foot in the game, these are technically warriors, are these Scots Highlanders. These appear in most of the Scots lists, as well as the Scots Isles list, where they are most prominent. These units have 50% of their men bow capable, which means that they do half as much damage as regular bowmen. They still have impact foot, similar to the units we just described, and full swordsman. They are only average in quality, though, which means that once the melee is joined against full swordsman, for example, unless they break them with their impact, they are going to be on even footing. But the combination of bows means that you can use these to pressure enemies into attacking you, especially because a lot of other medium foot, for example, only have protected or less armor. So the ability of these units is quite strong, and they have a price according to that, just based on that capability. So, but definitely a very unique unit. It's one of the only composite units in the entire game, but they aren't even really true composite units either, because the entire unit can do impact and swords, whereas composite units that appear in later expansions have 50%, 50% with their distribution of armament. One unit worth mentioning real quick that is unique to the Teutonic Order and that is in itself interesting are these Baltic levies. These units have light spear and full sword, so unlike the, for example, irregular foot that a lot of factions get. But they have a problem, which is that their troop quality is below average, and I believe that the overall penalty for this is something like a -13 to their point of advantage. So the issue is, on impact, they're more likely to lose. Their troop quality means that their cohesion checks, I believe that that's low enough to affect their cohesion checks as well. And against full swordsmen, they are also going to be losing on their own. So these units are good against archers and bowmen and crossbowmen, who they will still have a sword advantage on. For the most part, though, these units are in kind of a losing position in the rough. So, but these are unique to the Teutons, so I thought I would mention them for sure. Now, the last units that I wanted to mention as part of the medium foot section are these Brythonic foot. I have never been sure how to pronounce that word. These are medium foot with light spear and swords, but unlike the Teutonic Baltic levies, these are average troop quality, which means they actually perform quite well in rough terrain and such, and will have better impact than, for example, the brigands will have worse impact against these units, but standard medium foot philosophy applies. Keep these in the rough, fight against archers with these, they do quite well, and that's more or less it for medium foot. So next we're going to move on to melee cavalry, which is going to cover a rather large range of units. Now, each melee cavalry unit they're kind of similar and kind of extremely different. So each variation of melee cavalry unit I'm going to discuss as its own topic, because it's kind of hard to lump them together, because on the one hand, all cavalry can flank and cause automatic, cohesion drops and such, but the way that you use these units is drastically different depending on their capabilities. The first unit we're going to talk about are the early Knights and Sergeants. We call them early because these are still wearing the non-heraldic mail. They usually have these lighter lances, but for all intents and purposes, these are basically the same as the late Knights except for their armor. So what I'm going to do is talk about these units as their own, and then talk about how the heavy armor of the later Knights changes how you use the unit. So early Knights and Sergeants are also faster than later Knights. They are as maneuverable as medium cavalry, and in some situations this can actually make them more useful than later Knights, because they still have the same capabilities, but they are much more capable in terms of movement, which can provide them a lot of opportunities, such as being able to charge at archers from 3 distance away, which means that they are less likely to just get completely chewed up by archers and crossbows on the approach, because they can stay at range. That being said, though, these early Knights and Sergeants are only armored. Now, the problem is armored for horses, for mounted units, is different than armored for foot units. This is because the horses, and you can see this in the unit model as well, are more exposed than foot. So when you use these units, you need to be much more cognizant of archers, javelins, crossbows, anything projectile related can really chew these units up. And the problem is, even though these units are superior, They aren't heavy foot, so they aren't getting an automatic +1 to their cohesion checks either. So how you use these units can vary depending on the matchup. And while that's true for most units, with knights it's perhaps the most true. In the open against factions that are fielding a lot of standard defensive spearmen, these knights and sergeants are actually quite effective just placed in the center of your line and used to just charge and run down the enemy line, especially if you put a bunch of these on one flank where they can just completely crash through and break the enemy formation. And unless your opponent responds to that, these early knights are very, very effective at this. Now, one difference between the armor of these early knights and sergeants and the later ones is in how effective they are in melee. But it should be noted that the reason that knights are so incredibly effective in this game is that they cause a -2 cohesion test to any unit that they win a melee against. So if these units win against spearmen are normally at a +1 for being heavy foot. If they lose a close combat to knights, they're effectively at a -1, which it's basically how cohesion checks work is they run a number from 0 to 12 using dice, and the target that you need to hit is 6, right? And what can happen as a result of this is that with Knightly Lancers charge things, that extra -1 or -2 rather overall causes a lot of units that you would normally find dependable, such as spearmen, other heavy foot, to break a lot easier than you would suspect. And how these units work is when you charge, if they cause a disruption, they will stay in melee and use their swords, because the odds of the swords continuing to break the unit down further, along with their superior troop quality, is going to mean that staying in melee is advantageous for them. This can get knights into trouble, though, if they suddenly become swarmed by infantry. So what you want to do with these is make sure that when you're charging that you're not only breaking through the line at one point where the knights, if they do break through, are just going to get surrounded, or even at the front if they just get charged by other units. Now, one thing about Knightly Lancers is they more or less can't be charged by anything except other Knightly Lancers from the front. So you can also use Knights and Sergeants to zone out enemy units, because they more or less can't charge you without causing issues to themselves. And even if defensive spears do charge Knights and Sergeants, the Knights and Sergeants will just fall back and refuse the engagement, making these incredibly difficult to deal with melee infantry, as you might suspect. Now, that being said, how do you deal with Knights and Sergeants? One of the easiest ways with early Knights is to just use light archers and light javelins, slingers. I think the Polish get light slingers, massed bowmen, and crossbows, especially crossbows, are very effective against these units because the crossbow kind of doesn't care about the armor at all. So that being said, what you want to do to defeat knights is you want to disrupt them. Once knights are disrupted, they more or less lose their ability to take spearmen on in the front. And your goal when fighting these should be to do that. As someone using knights, you should similarly be cognizant of the fact that your opponent is probably going to try to disrupt your knights using their own missile units. And with these earlier knights and sergeants, that is a lot easier to do just due to their lower armor level. And more or less on the frontal engagement side of things, you want to just continually cycle charge. Always leave space behind these units so that they are capable of cycle charging, because if you block the retreat path of a unit of knights, with light units, with your own units, whatever, they cannot cycle charge. They will be stuck in melee. And so one trick you can actually do is if you can get units around to the flanks of knights, you can charge them with offensive spearmen, defensive spearmen, and if those spearmen stay steady against, they're going to lose the charge, but if they stay steady, they will be able to win over time against the knights who are unable to back off of the engagement. So as one of them, you would expect these to be some of the most influential units in the game, and they are. With the earlier knights, they are faster but less armored, and thus more prone to being killed by projectiles. The later knights, or just late knights and sergeants as we usually call them, Those are more resistant to bows, but still can be disrupted by projectiles. The heavy armor, or by crossbows rather, the heavy armor also gives the later knights even more power once the melee phase begins, so after the charge. And one final note about these is that while you can use these to roll up spearmen in the open, especially if you can get these uphill, spearmen do negate. Normally, knights have 200 point of advantage when charging. This is reduced to 150 when charging defensive spearmen, which usually makes it so that they have about a 60% chance to win a close combat against spearmen. So, yeah, and that's more or less what you need to know about knights and sergeants. I believe I covered the difference between the heavily armored and normally armored versions. But if I think of anything else as I do this video, I will mention that later on. This pair of units I'm going to call military order knights. So these are going to be your Teutonic order knights, sword brothers, hospitaller knights, etc. If you happen to get some of the expansions in the base game, they only appear to the Teutonic order and the sword brethren, I believe. They're basically the same as late knights and sergeants. So these units right here, the difference is that they are highly superior instead of superior, which I believe gives them 13 more point of advantage relative to the normal knights and sergeants. And because that isn't very big of an advantage, they're only 3 points more. They're just kind of a cool unit that I wanted to mention because they exist. Now, the next unit that I want to mention are sergeants, and I'm going to use sergeants as an opportunity to compare them to knights and discuss knights in a broader context. So, sergeants are only half the price of knights, but their role is very different. Sergeants are they have lancer capability, which opposed to knightly lancers is far less POA on the impact. These units are they are incapable of charging spearmen from the front unless those spearmen are already disordered or disrupted. Now, these units still have a lot of uses. They are extremely useful for setting up flanks, as they are more mobile than late knights. They are still armored, so they have okay protection against bows, but not great. And as well, they are quite good against archers and running them down, because the Lancer POA is very effective against those types of units, especially against massed bowmen who are even worse against those types of charges. Now, I'm actually going to take a second to talk about Knights and Sergeants again real quick. They have a dismount option, and functionally when they dismount, what they become is, for late knights, they become heavy weapon users. So they're like your dismounted knights and sergeants that you see in the German lists, for example. But the problem is the unit is only half the size of a regular unit, which means that while they are superior and they are heavily armored, they are only going to be so effective against regular spearmen, for example. They're not going to be as strong as you would suspect this unit to be while dismounted. The main reason that you would ever want to dismount cavalry is if you're on a map that has a ton of not open terrain. So that includes rough terrain, forest, streams and rivers, for example. Those are about the only situations you would want to dismount these units in, especially streams they do okay in, as opposed to the mounted version of the unit. Overall, though, dismounting is not really recommended. It's kind of better to just bring full infantry at that point if you're expecting a situation where you're not going to be able to use knights very effectively. The next list of units we're going to talk about here are, I call them light spear cavalry. They are what you would think of as cavalry from like earlier periods. So, like Roman times, for example, where they're just charging in and they're using their spear with their hand instead of couching a lance and charging. These units are okay. They aren't as effective against, for example, archers and such, because the light spear point of advantage against ground targets is only 50, which means that these units are even worse at frontally charging units. So take what I said about these sergeants before, about how you should only, use them against, medium foot, against crossbows and archers. And this is like doubly so with these. And these have an even worse time with spearmen, because while Lancer cavalry such as sergeants and knights and sergeants, they remove the offensive advantage of offensive spears. So offensive spears, for example, can't charge Lancers. They lose all of their impact POA, even like offensive spears. These units, that is not true for. Their light spears mean that on the impact, the offensive spearmen actually have the advantage if these units charge. So even more so than sergeants, these units are meant to flank around the sides, attack vulnerable units, run down Lightfoot, those sorts of things, and get automatic cohesion drops from attacking on the flank, of course. One thing that's notable about these is if you are using them in conjunction with knights and sergeants against an enemy that has knights and sergeants, these are quite good at getting an automatic drop on those units if they can flank around to the side, because they're also much cheaper. Now, along with this lighter cavalry, this light spear cavalry archetype, are these armored noble cavalry and the Rus Druzina. These two unit archetypes, even though they're superior and armored, still can't really do the job of lancers against infantry. What these units do better, though, than those is if they can get stuck in melee with some of the heavier cavalry units, like knights, for example, they can do a cost-effective job against those, specifically if they're able to outnumber and overwhelm them. That being said, once these units join melee, the extra armor and swordsman point of advantage do make them quite effective at disrupted spears. So how you use these units, especially as opposed to the, not superior, more lightly armored version, is if you disrupt a unit first, of like spearmen, for example, these units are quite effective at charging them in that regard. Both the regular cavalry and the armored noble cavalry do have a dismount option, but these types of units are more common in lists that are fighting horse archers, for example. And one final point about these is that while they do have the appearance of them, these units are not knightly lancers, and you definitely should never use them as such, even though they are quite expensive and pricey. They have their uses, but generally speaking, I think of these armored light spear cavalry as very niche. One unit that is fairly unique with regards to this discussion of cavalry is the Lithuanian early cavalry. These units come with above average quality, some armor, and a light spear sword setup. So these units can do everything I described that light spear sword cavalry are capable of, are decently cost effective for that role, and have an option to dismount with a bow. Now, when these units dismount, as you can see here, they more or less become a half-strength unit of bows. But what's interesting about these units is that because they have a sword capability, they are more or less as effective as massed bowmen are, generally speaking, within 2 range. At longer distances, these aren't quite good, but the ability for this unit to effectively turn into a ranged unit makes them quite useful, as the full swordsman point of advantage makes them quite effective at hiding in rough terrain. So functionally, with this unit, you get a quite effective medium foot archer and light spear cavalry unit, which makes these Lithuanian cavalry some of the most versatile units of the entire game, especially in the base set. And the last melee cavalry unit we're going to discuss from the base game of Field of Glory 2 Medieval are these best equipped cavalry that are available to the Mongols as well as the Tatars. Now, what makes these units interesting is that they are highly superior, so they have a very high point of advantage from their veterancy. They are well armored, which I believe is similar. It's similar to heavily armored, if not better. And they have full bow capability as well as lancer capability and sword capability. So these units are horse archers, they are lancers, and they are swordsmen, which means that you can use these units alongside regular horse archers to disrupt enemy units, then charge them with the lancer point of advantage that they have. So very versatile units and just very effective all around, but only available to 2 lists in the base game. Now, very quickly, since I mentioned the Lithuanian dismounts, I thought it would only be fair to talk about knights and sergeants as well. I already kind of touched on this in the knights and sergeants section, but with the dismounted knights and sergeants from horseback, it is similar to the Lithuanian situation where you are getting half of a normal unit. What's different about these, and one reason you might want to do this, is in archer heavy lists, the knights and sergeants will take a lot more damage, even though they are heavily armored and generally can ignore bows. Against crossbow heavy lists and horse archer lists, these units can suffer as a result of their armor level. When dismounted, they take a lot less damage from those types of units, which makes them rather effective. But the main reason that you would want to use these units dismounted ever is non-open terrain. So, for example, we can see here that I have a unit of knights and sergeants. They are severely disordered, and when they are severely disordered, they also lose their knightly lancer point of advantage, which means that these units are functionally incapable of charging in rough terrain. So, at least from the front, they can still perform flanks, although not very effectively, because even once they get the automatic drop on an enemy, they go back to their sword POA, which is being severely reduced by the disorder of the unit in this situation. Now, these dismounted knights and sergeants, when they are like this, are still somewhat capable of fighting in rough ground. They are not great. They are probably still going to lose to medium foot, for example. But if you're on a map, for example, that has, tons of very high hills that, you can't, there's no situation where your knights can be used. It's rare, but it does happen. And you're playing a list like the French, which has a ton of these units. It can be effective to dismount these units in mass and kind of use them to hold choke points, because on top of a hill, even in rough terrain, if they are having an uphill advantage, these units can still do a lot of work holding choke points, for example. So those are pretty much the only situations you'd want to dismount these. There's no stream on this map, but if there was, streams are another situation where knights lose their knightly lancer point of advantage. So again, if it's another situation of the map being very rough, lots of forest, rough terrain, and hills, dismounting the knights in those scenarios can help as well. The issue is that these units start their battles outnumbered against most regular foot, so they are losing a lot of their advantage from being superior, from being heavily armored, in addition to being more expensive than the units that they're more or less on equal terms with. So dismounting with these is definitely possible. It has some uses, but should be used very, very sparingly, is kind of the general point I'm trying to make. Now, next on our list of discussion is ranged non-light cavalry, and it is worth noting the difference on these just because they are quite different. Now, something I completely forgot to mention with light spear cavalry is that they have a tendency to retreat when they don't like the odds of what they're fighting, whereas knights will never do this. Horse archers are in a similar situation where they are going to retreat from combat if they don't like their odds of winning on impact, which can cause them to retreat into situations which will cause them to be caught, attacked from behind, suffer an automatic cohesion drop, and more or less instantly break as a result of this. So these units need to have a lot of open space to be able to operate. They are most likely going to run away from what they're fighting, and if they are one range away from something, there's a high chance that they will be caught by the cavalry chasing them. So when using these units, you want to make sure that you keep their distance when you can, and as well use them in large quantities together, because their firepower is a lot less than foot archers, as you would probably expect from the fact that they are usually only half the size of those units. Now, the first unit that we're going to talk about in the horse archer category is actually mounted crossbowmen. Crossbowmen, as you may suspect, are better against armor than bows are, and so these units are quite effective working in pairs or triplets to attack knights, especially in conjunction with light archers and light crossbowmen. You can use these to get into the flanks of a unit of knights and just have them constantly pepper them with crossbow bolts, hopefully getting a disruption which would give you a critical advantage in being able to actually defeat them. Now, something else that mounted crossbowmen can do, in addition to all horse archers that are non-light, is that they can fairly safely charge into the flanks of things. They do have full swordsman point of advantage, which the rest of the horse archer class of units is also going to have, meaning that you can use these to get automatic disruptions on knights, on cavalry, on infantry. So even though these are horse archers technically, these are quite effective at flanking as well, which makes them quite cost effective considering that most of the time when you're going to flank, any unit that happens to be there is good for that job. So ultimately, use these units when you can. Some lists rely entirely on them, such as the Mongols, for example, and the Cumans and the Tatars. But generally speaking, these are quite effective units when you don't have to use a ton of them, which those lists do, and these have their own problems. The largest vulnerability of this unit, even though it is armored, is that it is going to get shot to pieces by any dedicated bow units. So massed archers, longbowmen are extremely effective against these types of cavalry, and against cavalry in general, and crossbowmen at 2 range are also going to absolutely chew these units up. So when using these horse archer type units, you need to be very careful of foot archers, because even light archers can do very significant damage to them very quickly. Now, I likely could have mentioned this in the melee cavalry section. I just put it here because they do have bows. These Zsekler cavalry for the Hungarians have half of their unit is bow capable, and they also have a light spear and sword. So everything I've said in the other section about light spear, sword, cavalry, so only use these units on the flank, their impact is just not very good, etc., is true for this unit as well. They are above average quality, which is great. Some armor is better than protected status, which a lot of cavalry have. And the 50% bow, it gives them some options. It's not the greatest thing in the world. 50% bow on a unit that's only 50% strong in the first place is not very effective, but with a couple of these, and the Hungarians can bring quite a few of these can be quite effective at disrupting other cavalry, especially those that are only protected. Now, similarly to the Lithuanian cavalry that we saw before, the Zseklers are able to dismount and become above average bow swordsman units at half strength. And what this means is that they're quite good in parking in rough terrain and standing on top of hills, where they can shoot things, disrupt them before they get up the hill, and then hopefully defeat them, which makes these, similarly to the Lithuanian cavalry, quite effective. What's different about the Zseklers compared to the Lithuanian cavalry, though, is that these units have half of their unit bow capable even on horseback, whereas the Lithuanians only get their bows after they've dismounted. Now, the next unit that we will be talking about appears in a ton of lists, so I'm going to try to give them a little bit more attention, even though I've talked a lot about what these units can do with the mounted crossbowman description. These nomad horse archers are generally used to disrupt enemy units and then charge them after they have been disrupted. So how you want to use these is in packs of units. I typically shoot for about 4 or even 5 if I can, and have them single out a specific unit, shoot it until it is disrupted in the case of archers and medium foot, or in the case of heavy foot, such as spearmen, you have to wait until those units are fragmented before you can charge them with these units, because they have no impact capability whatsoever. And so the only way that they can deal with heavy foot and such is by charging them after they have already been fragmented, and hopefully that causes a chain route and stuff like that. Now, these units do appear in a lot of lists, and the main thing to keep in mind about them is you need to be very careful with their ammunition. If you just run them up and shoot at things, willy-nilly, you aren't really focusing fire and stuff like that, aren't triggering cohesion checks by damaging at least 11% of the unit, these units are incredibly ineffective because they won't ever actually break enemy units and have no way of engaging once they actually do. Now, where these units get painful to use is in lists similar to the Cumans here, for example, where most of their army is going to be made up of these units. But the problem is that these units don't perform particularly well against heavy foot, even when massed. These units are most effective against other cavalry. So you want to have them, pepper the enemy. And the thing about cavalry is it's more vulnerable to missiles due to having fewer men in the unit, and because nomad horse archers and other horse archers are more effective against horses than they are against infantry because they have composite bows. Now, All of that being said, the general rule with these is just remember, make sure a unit is, disrupted or fragmented before charging them. To do that, you need to damage at least 11% of the unit, trigger a cohesion check, and then that is the only time that unit can drop in a turn. So if you're shooting a unit with these horse archers, or with any ranged unit, and the unit drops a cohesion level, you should stop shooting that unit, generally speaking, because you aren't going to get much more value out of your shots for the rest of that turn. With some units, though, you may see that the first cohesion check you trigger fails. If a unit takes a significant amount of casualties, I believe it's something like 20%. I have to check the manual for that. And after checking that manual, the amount that you need to trigger another -1 to cohesion checks is 16%. You can open your combat log by pressing C after shooting a unit, and this will tell you whether or not that modifier has been applied. If a unit has already received that modifier and still hasn't dropped a cohesion level, that means you should stop shooting that unit, because you're not going to... It doesn't roll the cohesion check for shooting for every individual check. It rolls it for the turn. So what you want to do is, with horse archers, or archers in general, is shoot a unit until it reaches its cohesion check level. If it doesn't drop after reaching that 16% casualty threshold, then you stop shooting and you wait for next turn so that you don't run out of ammunition. Because archers that run out of ammunition, especially horse archers, begin to completely lose all effectiveness, and you obviously don't want that to happen. So the name of the game here with these horse archers is be very sparing with your ammo. Try to take favorable engagements with them by giving yourself big retreat paths and such, that you can't just be completely chased off or run down by other cavalry, and have them focus fire on targets until they disrupt and hopefully fragment, at which point you can charge them. And the beauty, one thing that is in the horse archer's favor, is that these units are fairly cheap for what they bring to the field. They do have a ranged option, they do have full sword POA, and against medium foot and bowmen, they actually get a bonus POA against charging them, just not against heavy foot. One unit unique to the Mongols and the Tatars is the Mongol Tatar Cavalry. These are more or less the nomad horse archers that we've seen before, that I just talked about, but they have an extra level of troop quality that does make them a little bit better at charging units just from the troop quality alone, although they're still not great at it. Otherwise, you functionally use these units the same. What's different about these units as well is that they also have a dismount option, at which point they function very similarly to the dismounted Lithuanian and Jekler cavalry. The last unit we have to talk about in the horse archer list are the expert armored horse archers. These are functionally similar to the regular horse archers, just that they have more armor, so they're more resilient to missiles. Although, again, armored is still not super protective against missiles. These units can still become disrupted by bows very easily, especially against other horse archers. But their bow capability is going to be better because they are of superior quality, which I believe gives them something like a 10% better shooting capacity. Overall, though, because of their price, this means that they're actually worse at shooting, and what you really want to use these units for is, A, they're quite good in dismount situations. They are similar to the dismounted Lithuanian cavalry, but because of the armor, they're much better in melee. So they have a very interesting niche to perform there on maps with a lot of rough terrain. You can dismount these and have them work to decent effect, especially because archers that have a melee capability, such as dismounted horse archers like this, are better at shooting at 2 range than archers that don't have that. And we'll cover that more in that section. But more or less, these units are better archers on foot than you would expect, which is a capability that they possess. The superior quality means that when they are stuck in melee, they're going to perform better, although they're certainly still no match for knights and the like. And overall, these units are typically worth bringing. Just remember that they are not going to be cost-effectively as good at shooting as the lesser horse archers. So basically, you're trading price for a bit of better melee capability, which, depending on the matchup, may or may not be worth it to you. Now, with that, we are ready to talk about another unit class. We are now going to begin talking about massed archers. What we mean by this is just a large block of foot archers that are shooting things at long range. One major difference between these units and horse archers is that massed archers are capable of shooting at 4 range, while horse archers are only capable of shooting at 2. Generally speaking, how you want to use these units is they perform quite well in rough terrain and on hills. When they have a height advantage over another unit, they can actually shoot over them. They don't get a bonus to their accuracy, so they won't deal additional damage while they are up higher on the hill. But the ability to shoot over the front line can allow you to disrupt enemies in front of your main line, which can be rather devastating. Something else that these units perform quite well at doing, generally speaking, is at dealing with enemy cavalry, especially if the cavalry are trying to ride around a hill or something. Even when turning and shooting, these units are quite effective at dealing with them. Now, all of that being said, we're going to go over the first unit of this type, and those are they're just called archers. You will see a lot of variations of this type of unit, so archers, masked Muslim archers, masked Caucasian archers, all of these same 36-point archer units function the same. They are the same unit. And what's dangerous about these units is they have no melee capability, and mainly due to balancing reasons, these units, when there is a unit that is melee capable that is not light, and you can see this in the description here. Actually, you can't. When a unit, when a unit is within 2 tiles of them that does have a melee capability, these units lose about 20% of their firing capability. So what this means with these masked archers is that they function the same at 4 range as they do at 2 range. There is no advantage in getting these units closer to other melee units. So the only time that these units do well at 2 range is against other archers or against light units, which they perform rather well against. Now, all of that being said, due to the lack of melee capability, these mass archers just absolutely melt to anything with melee capability whatsoever. So light spear cavalry, any kind of medium foot with melee capability are just going to absolutely chew these units up. Massed archers in particular are just extremely vulnerable to being attacked as such, and you should be cognizant of that when using these units. I generally don't like to bring too many of these units when I do bring them, because they have this tendency to just kind of collapse once they start getting attacked, because they have no way of defending themselves for the most part. Now, interestingly about massed archers is that you can use them to set up automatic drops on infantry units. So say one of your spearmen's engaged, you see an opening for one of your archers to get into the flank arc of that unit, you can absolutely set these units up on the flank and attack with them, which does provide them another use that light archers, for example, don't have, even though light archers do shoot at 2 range at the same power as regular archers do at 4. Now, similarly to those, we also have on some of the English lists these Welsh longbowmen. Now, the longbow is a fairly legendary weapon. In this game, it is so-so. The main difference between these Welsh longbows and the regular archers is that these perform much better against armor. And that means is that these Welsh longbows are actually quite effective against knights and sergeants, which allows them to disrupt those units fairly regularly. They also do quite well against other armored units. So armored infantry, for example, these longbows do okay against those. The issue with these still, though, is that if their overall shooting power is just reduced by the fact that they either have to shoot at long range or they just shoot the same at 2 range anyway because of the penalty that they take. So use these with a grain of salt, because the longbow is fairly legendary, but these units are just kind of okay, is how I view them. Now, next on our list of ranged infantry, ranged foot, or bowmen, whatever you'd like to call them. I guess bowmen's the technical designation, are crossbowmen. And one notable difference with crossbowmen compared to archers is that they only cost 3 points more, but they have a 50% sword capability. This does more than you think it would. And the reason for this is within 2 range, because the crossbowmen have swords, they don't take the same 2 range penalty that masked archers do. So in addition to being able to fight in melee, so for example, say you get this unit on top of a hill, an enemy unit tries to charge it, it's got those 50% swords for 50 POA, plus whatever height advantage they've got. These units can be very tenacious. In hills, these units dominate hills, because even against other medium foot, these crossbowmen do rather effectively at, they can reduce the numbers of charging units, for example, which can cause them to win even melees you wouldn't expect them to. Crossbowmen are some of the most cost-effective units in the game, because in addition to having this sword capability, so they can attack other archers, for example, they can attack the mass bowmen because they have those swords. They also do extremely well against cavalry, similarly to the longbows, because they up to armored, these units perform better against armored targets than bows do, and against heavily armored and fully armored units, crossbows perform much better than regular bows, be it at long range or at short range. Where the crossbow really shines, though, is within 2 range. If you can get these units into a situation where they're shooting at a target 2 range away, they can be just as disruptive as bows can. For the same task, except against unprotected or lightly protected targets, where bows will perform better. These units also don't do super great against light targets. They have to spend a lot more ammunition to deal with those. But overall, crossbowmen are a very, very powerful unit that I recommend that you use if you have any kind of rough terrain. If you're dealing with knights, for example, these units are just super, super effective at disrupting those. And generally speaking, I would say that they are just much more valuable to have than the massed archers. That being said, massed archers do have their qualities. The main situation where these units suffer is actually against other archers. So other archers, especially the massed archers, are going to do better at long range versus crossbowmen than crossbowmen can shoot back, which is fairly notable. And against light units don't trigger the same issue that regular foot archers do. They don't trigger that penalty for having a unit with melee capability nearby, which means that light units that get within 2 tiles of a regular massed archer unit they're going to pay for it, basically, is what it comes down to. And that's the main difference between the two. The last unit we will just kind of discuss here for foot or ranged foot bowmen are raw crossbowmen. Now, raw crossbowmen have the issue that massed bowmen do, which is that they don't have melee capability. This means that obviously they, unlike the full crossbowmen, they cannot shoot things at 2 range and get their maximum effectiveness. So these units are functionally the same at 4 range as they are at 2 range due to that penalty against any unit that has melee capability that isn't light. So how do you use these units? Well, these raw crossbowmen have a very specific niche. They are very good at being cost-effective against cavalry units. Parked on a hill or anywhere where they can shoot from a long distance away, they can disrupt cavalry, including knights and sergeants, even though they are extremely cheap at 21 points. Similarly to raw spearmen, raw crossbowmen over the course of a campaign, once they reach a certain quality, will also become regular crossbowmen, which means that they're quite a cost-effective way to get a lot of really good units in a campaign scenario. But for the most part, these units are, similarly to archers, are extremely squishy. They are functionally useless against infantry because they are never going to deal enough damage to cause a disruption. And against other archers, they get absolutely crushed. So there's a reason these units cost 21 points, but they can be very cost effective against cavalry. In any other situation, though, these units are a liability for the most part. Keep them away from melee and only have them shoot at horses, and that's more or less how you use these units. Alright, we are starting to near the end here. We have 2 more categories to go. The first type is going to be light foot, or skirmishers, whichever you would like to call them. Light foot includes light archers, light javelin men, light slingers, later handgunners, and light crossbowmen. Light archers are the first ones we're going to talk about here. These are surprisingly effective units that you don't really want to shoot at long range with. They can shoot at 4 range, but the amount of damage that they deal at that range is fairly minimal. These units are extremely agile. They are capable of moving once, turning, and shooting, and they will typically evade melee. Now, with any light unit, you want to be careful because they can get run down by cavalry, especially if they're only 1 tile away when the cavalry begins to charge. So you should always be careful of that when using these units. That being said, these are extremely effective units for harassing enemies, as you would suspect. The primary difference between light archers and light javelin men is the range. Light archers perform the same at 2 range as light javelins do at 1 range, but javelins don't have the option of shooting at 2 range. So In general, light archers are better just because they have a huge positional advantage that is almost certainly worth the extra 6 points every time that you bring them. Apart from that, you're going to use these similarly to regular archers. You want to mass them on a flank usually. Light archers are great for warding off things like light crossbows, which are the bane of knights usually. So light archers are quite effective at screening for your heavy cavalry and protecting them from enemy lights. And even if you have enough of these too, you can also send them against massed archers and crossbows if you can mass a volley to cause disruption to those types of units as well. These can disrupt heavy foot if you have enough of them, but that is less ammo effective than some of the other tasks that they can perform. Really quickly, since they're in the same list, we will talk about the light javelin men as well. The primary difference with these is, in addition to, of course, the javelins only having one range, which do the same damage as bows do, but because of the positional disadvantage this has, this overall means they are generally less effective than light archers. However, interestingly, the javelins give them a high impact point of advantage against other light units. So something fun you can do with light javelins is you can actually have them charge other lights, and if the enemy lights don't evade, they will do quite well against them. It can be quite scary for your own light archers, for example, if these units come up and you don't manage to disrupt them before they get into charge range. So that's kind of what makes javelin men unique. However, generally speaking, you would probably prefer light archers just because the range advantage provides so many more opportunities for being able to actually use the unit. A very small number of units or lists get this in the base game, but I'm still going to mention them. There are these light slingers, and light slingers are very cost-effective units because they function very similarly to bow units. They can just only shoot at 1 and 2 range, and they only, I believe, get their full ability at 1 range. So these are kind of like javelin men, but with an option for shooting at 2 range, but without the melee capability, which is why they're still 24 points. They're still fairly cost-effective, though, as many light units typically are, but overall they are kind of inferior to light bowmen. The final light unit we're going to talk about here is also one of the most important. These are light crossbowmen. And light crossbowmen have a very specific function. Similarly to the raw crossbowmen, these are primarily used for disrupting cavalry because light crossbows don't have the firepower due to their smaller numbers to cause cohesion checks on infantry, other light units like archers can. So the primary advantage of these, and the reason that they're 30 points, is that at 2 range, they are still very effective against most cavalry units. So what you can use these for is disrupting knights before contact. Even 2 of these can sometimes cause cohesion checks to knights if you have good rolls on the amount of casualties inflicted, which means that for 60 points you can effectively knock out a unit of knights and sergeants as long as you follow up with your own knights when dealing with that. And so that makes these units very dangerous. When you fight lists that have these, you typically want to prioritize dealing with these units with your own archers and such, because otherwise your cavalry are going to have a very bad time for the most part. That being said, every light crossbowman that you have is a light archer you don't have, so typically these are going to be screened with their own light units to kind of allow them to do their own job. But for the most part, these, like regular crossbowmen, are extremely effective. They have all the skirmishing properties that regular light units have, so these are usually a worthwhile addition to most lists, especially in Europe when you're going up against knights and sergeants and such. And with that, we are finally on to light horse. Light horse is an interesting class of unit to use. They are surprisingly more effective at charging than you would expect, especially ones with light javelins. But these ones in particular we're going to start with are horse archers. So one thing to note about these is they do have sword POA. These are capable of running down light infantry, which can be kind of scary, but only if those units are not engaged in melee. So if these units get shot first while trying to approach light archers, they will likely get disrupted, and these units have to be used with care because they can get chewed up very badly by foot archers. Now, all that being said, how you use these units is fairly simple. For the most part, light horse archers are good against other cavalry units, especially non-heavily armored ones. They are capable of riding to their flanks. Because of their high mobility, they are able to catch cavalry a lot faster than light infantry are, and they're able to shoot them in groups, usually, is how you use these, to cause disruptions that allow your other cavalry to do what they want to do. Now, something else that these can be used to do is to kind of distract enemies. So, one really annoying thing about most light units, especially light horse, is that you can park these in really inconvenient locations for the enemy to the point where they have to charge you to be able to deal with you. But the problem is they can't catch you. It's something like the only way to catch a light horse archer is to charge it from the diagonal, and even then you only have like a 1 in 16 chance of catching these. So you can park these in all kinds of annoying places. You can use these to block retreats. You can use these to block enemy paths, which makes them a lot more effective than their actual combat capability would suggest. Something else kind of funny you can do with these is you can park them behind your own units, and sometimes you want units to stay in when they won't. So, for example, defensive spears sometimes don't want to stay in to fight. Nomad light horse archers, once the battle has started, are incredibly useful for stopping your own units from running away. If for some reason you need them to stay to get a flank, for example, as units will often back off from a charge if they don't like their odds. So, in general, you use these to disrupt horses. They can attack light infantry, and you can use these to be really annoying and block a lot of pathing and stuff for the enemy, and make them take really crappy charges that won't ever give them anything because the light horse will always evade. So overall, very utilitarian units. They can charge archers, but their odds of actually breaking them are relatively low compared to perhaps the danger they might face. But that being said, these units are only 32 points, so even if you lose one, it's not a big deal. Now, less common in the base game and more common in some of the expansions, especially Reconquista with some of the Berber lists and the Spanish lists, you have light javelin horse. And unlike light javelin infantry, light foot, light javelin horse are incredibly effective units. They are very cheap. Their ability to throw javelins is weaker than the bows of the nomad light horse archers and has less range. But something very interesting about these units is that they have a javelin capability, which gives them a 50 point of advantage when charging things. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but due to the incredible mobility of these units, it is very easy to get them into advantageous positions where they can flank charge enemy units. So you can surprisingly do a lot of damage by having these flank charge archers, flank charge enemy cavalry, things of that nature, and sometimes get disruptions that can prove to be fairly critical, in addition to the advantage of being able to throw javelins. So you can get into situations where these units can kind of move in a pack and throw javelins, disrupt something, and then cycle charge it from its flanks until finally these units of light horse have defeated whatever it is you've sent them after. And that makes them incredibly effective, and due to this impact PoE, they're also extremely effective at running down other light units too. So very, very cost-effective units. These are some of the best light horse in the game, and some of my favorite units overall, I would say, just in terms of cost efficacy. I have had these units charge knights and sergeants before and cause a disruption. It's not very likely, but it can happen, and that's what makes these so deadly. And finally, we have the Lithuanian light horse early, as well as the Hungarian Zekler light horse. Now, these units are similar to the javelin horse I just described, but what's different about these is that these have swordsman PoA, which means that after these units charge in, if they cause a disruption, they may stay in and continue to use their sword PoA to continue to grind up whatever they're fighting against, which makes these, again, incredibly cost-effective units if you happen to have a faction that gets them. They are fairly rare, but effective nonetheless. Unfortunately, there are, to my knowledge, no light-mounted crossbows in the base game. I do believe some of the expansions add some of those later. But for the time being, that is the final unit that I feel is worth discussing out of the base game list of Field of Glory 2 Medieval. If you have any questions, please add them in the comments. This game is quite complex. The unit interactions cover a wide variety of different possible options, and what I've talked about here is only barely scratching the surface, and is more of just kind of a starting point for new players. And I know I just spent an hour and a half or whatever talking about this, and it's just barely scratching the surface. But hey, that's Tactics War Games for you. What are you gonna do? Anyway, I wanted to thank you all for watching. If you would like to see more Field of Glory 2 videos in the future, or if you enjoyed this one, go ahead and let me know, and I will see you all on the next one.